There's a particular kind of arrivals hall silence that exists only in the very early morning, before the day's real crowds arrive. Just a scattering of drivers holding handwritten signs and a few disoriented travelers blinking under fluorescent light. Everyone moving through it half asleep. Everyone assuming the morning will unfold exactly as planned. Most men walking through that silence are looking for their name on a piece of cardboard. This is the story of a man who found his name, and found, standing beside it, a stranger holding considerably more than a sign. I spent 39 years managing hotels across the southwest of England, the last 14 of them running a well-regarded property in Plymouth overlooking the Hoe. And if there's one professional skill that career gives you, it's the ability to read a guest before they've said a single word, to sense a problem brewing 3 days before it becomes an actual complaint, to manage an experience so carefully that the guest never once feels the management happening around them. I started as a junior porter at 19, worked my way steadily through every department a hotel actually needs to function properly: front desk, housekeeping supervision, food and beverage, before finally landing in general management in my early 40s, learning at every rung of that ladder exactly how much a guest's confidence in a place depends on things they never consciously notice. And I built my entire working identity on exactly that quiet, invisible vigilance, the specific satisfaction of a well-run property where nothing ever quite goes visibly wrong because someone competent caught the problem 3 steps before it could, a vigilance I once considered nearly infallible. I retired at 63 with a comfortable pension, a small flat overlooking the water, and a specific, unhurried confidence that I understood people, professionally, in a way most men my own age simply didn't. My wife, Marion, died of ovarian cancer 5 years before I met Odessa, a decline that took the better part of a year and left me, at the end of it, genuinely unsure how to occupy an evening that didn't involve caring for someone, the specific rhythm of hospital visits and medication schedules leaving a silence behind it that felt, at first, almost physically strange to sit inside. We'd been married 31 years, since I was 28 and she was 26, meeting when she'd come through my hotel as a young events coordinator, working a conference I happened to be overseeing that week. Our daughter Claire settled in Bristol with her own family, called most weeks dutiful and warm, but I found myself, in the years following Marion's death, filling a specific, persistent quiet with work long past the point most men would have slowed down, staying at the hotel most evenings, well beyond what the job actually required, and then, once I finally did retire, discovering that the quiet had simply been waiting for me the whole time, patient, undiminished by 4 decades of busy hotel corridors. I met Odessa online, on a site a colleague from my hotel days had mentioned almost as a joke, and I want to be honest that I approached the whole thing with real skepticism at first, the same professional caution I'd have brought to a supplier's unusually generous quote, spending my first few weeks on the platform mostly reading rather than messaging, wary of exactly the kind of story I'd eventually find myself living, having heard enough cautionary tales secondhand over the years from other guests and colleagues to know, in the abstract, exactly what kind of trap I was supposedly guarding against. She was 34, working in a resort's guest relations department in Iloilo City, and our early conversations, I remember distinctly, felt genuinely substantive rather than performed, trading stories about difficult guests and impossible requests. The specific, shared language of 2 people who'd both spent careers absorbing other people's stress with a smile, comparing notes on the particular exhaustion of a hospitality career that most people outside the industry never fully understand. I found myself looking forward to those conversations with an intensity that surprised me. A man in his early 60s rediscovering, almost against his own better judgment, the specific thrill of being genuinely interesting to someone again, checking my phone in the evenings with an eagerness I hadn't felt in years. We spoke daily for the better part of a year before I ever flew out to meet her in person. Video calls most evenings, long messages exchanged across the time difference, waking sometimes deliberately at odd hours, simply to catch a window when we could both talk properly, rather than trading rushed, half-asleep messages, setting an alarm for 3 in the morning, more than once just to see her face on the screen, for 20 uninterrupted minutes, before either of us had to be anywhere. And I want to be clear that this wasn't a whirlwind decision made on a single trip. By the time I finally booked that first flight, I felt I knew Odessa as well as I'd known anyone in years, and the visit itself, 3 weeks spent largely in Iloilo City, with occasional trips further afield, only deepened that sense, the two of us settling easily into an ordinary, comfortable rhythm that felt, at the time, like exactly the kind of quiet compatibility I'd once had with Marion. She introduced me to her mother, to two of her sisters, to a wide circle of friends who all seemed to genuinely like her, gathering easily around a table for long, warm dinners that stretched well into the evening. Plates passed back and forth, laughter carrying out into the street, someone's radio playing softly from a neighboring house. Everyone treating me, a stranger from the other side of the world, with a warmth that felt entirely unforced. And I remember thinking, watching her move through that world with such easy warmth, that I'd found something considerably more solid than the online caution I'd started with had prepared me to expect. The proposal came on my second visit, about 8 months into the relationship, and I want to be honest that I proposed, rather than the reverse, on a beach outside the city at sunset, with a ring I'd had specially made back in Plymouth, a decision I'd arrived at with the same careful, considered process I'd once brought to a major capital decision at the hotel, not impulsive in the least, built on what felt, at the time, like an entirely sound foundation of shared understanding and genuine affection, months of daily conversation, and 2 separate extended visits behind us, rather than the kind of hasty, single-trip decision I'd read about in the very cautionary forums I'd occasionally browsed. Odessa cried, genuinely, and said yes, and I flew home a week later, already planning the wedding, already imagining the specific shape of the life we'd build together in whichever country we eventually settled, sketching out, on the flight home, a rough timeline I'd later refine into the actual wedding planning that consumed much of the following year. The 18 months that followed were, financially, considerably more involved than I'd initially anticipated, though I want to be honest that I never once felt, across that entire stretch, that I was being pressured into any single expense. Odessa's family had specific expectations around a wedding celebration, a proper venue, a guest list that grew considerably larger than the modest gathering I'd originally pictured, closer to 200 guests once every relative and family friend had been accounted for, a figure that startled me at first, before I reminded myself this was simply how things were done properly here, and I covered the deposit on a well-regarded venue outside the city, roughly £9,000, without much hesitation, understanding it as simply the cost of doing this properly, the way I'd once have approved a significant hotel renovation budget once I was satisfied the underlying business case held up. Beyond the venue, there were the rings, a proper engagement set and matching wedding bands I'd commissioned from a jeweler back home, and a house, a genuine, functioning 3-bedroom property outside Iloilo City that Odessa and I discussed at length as our shared future home, a purchase I made in her name given the legal restrictions on foreign ownership, structured, I believed at the time, exactly as carefully as any property transaction I'd ever have approved professionally, complete with an independent lawyer's review of the paperwork, a full site visit, a proper survey, every formal step I'd have insisted on for a genuine commercial acquisition, right down to a title search I'd specifically requested to confirm the land itself carried no prior encumbrances. Between the venue, the rings, the house, and the accumulating smaller costs, family contributions here, a cousin's tuition there, a nephew's medical bill another time, always framed reasonably, always accepted with what felt like genuine gratitude rather than expectation, each request delivered with just enough specific detail and just enough apparent reluctance that saying no would have felt, in the moment, both petty and entirely out of step with the generous, easy warmth I'd found in her family from the very beginning. My total spend across 18 months came to £58,000, a figure I'd calculated carefully myself, the same way I'd have tracked any major project's cumulative cost, understanding it not as money lost but as an investment in a life I fully expected to actually live. I flew into Iloilo City 4 days before the wedding, my barong already fitted during an earlier visit, my speech drafted and redrafted more times than I'd care to admit, genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy in a way I hadn't felt since long before Marian's diagnosis. The whole journey carrying the particular, giddy anticipation of a man arriving 4 days early, specifically to savor the last stretch of the wait, rather than merely survive it, mentally rehearsing, somewhere over the South China Sea, the exact words of the toast I planned to give at the reception. The flight had been long, the layover in Manila tighter than I'd have liked, some minor delay on the ground that had me genuinely worried about missing the connection entirely, and I remember walking through that arrivals hall at Iloilo Airport sometime around 6 in the morning, tired but buoyant, scanning the small cluster of drivers holding signs for the one I expected to be holding my name, arranged, Odessa had told me, through a car service she used regularly. The sign with my name on it was real enough. The man holding it was not who I expected. He looked to be in his 40s, calm in a specific, exhausted way I recognized immediately, from decades of managing hotel staff through long, difficult shifts, the particular composure of someone who'd reached the far side of some considerable ordeal, rather than someone bracing for one. Dressed simply, a plain-collared shirt, standing slightly apart from the other drivers with their own scattered signs. His own sign held with a steadiness that struck me even before he spoke. No nervous shuffling, no glancing around for reassurance. Just a man who had clearly already made his peace with whatever this particular morning was going to cost him. "Mr. Nightingale," he said, in careful, measured English, extending a hand I shook automatically, some old hospitality reflex kicking in, even in my confusion. "I'm Rodel. I'm Odessa's husband, not ex-husband. Can I buy you a coffee before you spend any more money?" I want to describe the specific, physical quality of that moment, standing in an airport arrivals hall with my suitcase still in hand, because I've turned it over more times than almost anything else in my 65 years on this earth. I didn't feel shock exactly, not immediately, more a kind of total, disorienting stillness. The sense of a floor that had always felt entirely solid, revealing, all at once, that it had never actually been load-bearing at all. The specific vertigo of a man whose entire 18-month narrative had just been quietly, completely rewritten in the space of a single sentence. I asked him, my voice coming out steadier than I felt, whether this was some kind of mistake, some case of confused identity. He shook his head, gently, not unkindly, and said, "I understand, if you don't believe me yet. I have documents. Please, just the coffee first." What followed was, without question, the strangest 90 minutes of my entire life. The two of us sitting at a small airport cafe table, with poor coffee going cold between us, comparing timelines and evidence with a specific, methodical calm that felt, looking back now, almost professionally absurd. Two men behaving like insurance adjusters working through a disputed claim, rather than two victims of the same woman, discovering each other for the first time. Rodel laid out photographs on the table, one after another, arranged in a careful sequence he'd clearly rehearsed. His own wedding to Odessa, 6 years earlier, a genuine, properly documented ceremony with the full traditional trappings, a modest reception hall, decorated with flowers I could see had been arranged by someone with real care, followed by photographs of two children, a boy and a girl, 7 and 4, alongside their birth certificates, both listing Odessa as their mother and Rodel as their father, the specific, undeniable weight of official government paperwork sitting there on that small cafe table between us. I asked him, my voice barely holding steady, how he'd found me, how he'd known to be standing in that arrivals hall at exactly the right moment, at exactly the right gate, among dozens of others that same morning. He explained, with the same measured calm, that he'd found our wedding planning on a shared tablet Odessa used for household matters, left unlocked one evening on the kitchen table while she was in the shower, a booking confirmation for the venue, a message thread with a caterer, my own name appearing across dozens of messages he'd initially assumed, he told me, must belong to some entirely unrelated business arrangement of his wife's, before the specific, accumulating detail, made the actual truth impossible to avoid any longer. "I found it 3 weeks ago, Mr. Nightingale," he said. "I have known for 3 weeks. I did not want to call you on the telephone and have you not believe a stranger's voice. I wanted you to see the papers with your own eyes." I asked him, because I needed to ask it even though I already understood, with a sick, sinking certainty, exactly what the answer would be, whether Odessa knew he'd discovered any of this. He said she didn't, not yet, that he'd deliberately kept his own composure intact around her these past 3 weeks, precisely so that this exact meeting could happen exactly as planned, at the airport, before she had any warning at all, before she could construct whatever explanation she might otherwise have had time to prepare. I understood, hearing that, the specific, careful precision of a man who'd clearly spent considerable time thinking through exactly how to deliver a truth this devastating, with as much fairness as the situation could possibly allow. I want to explain something about why none of this had ever registered, across an entire 18-month relationship, as something worth investigating more carefully, because I think it matters enormously to understanding how thoroughly I'd let my own professional instincts go quiet in exactly the one area of my life where I most needed them active. Odessa had explained, early in our relationship, that she'd been married once before, briefly, in her 20s, a marriage she described as a painful mistake that had ended in an annulment she was still, technically, finalizing through the local church courts, a process she described as slow, bureaucratic, genuinely frustrating for her, and one she asked me, gently, not to press her about too often, given how much distress the subject still caused her. I accepted that explanation completely, the same generous, uncritical acceptance I'd have extended to any guest's account of their own difficult circumstances, never once thinking to independently verify a claim that, in any other professional context, I'd have automatically cross-checked before proceeding with any significant transaction. Rodel, sitting across that small café table, filled in the actual shape of the years I'd only ever heard about through Odessa's careful, selective framing, speaking with the specific, unhurried patience of a man who'd clearly rehearsed this exact account more than once in his own head across the preceding 3 weeks. They'd married properly 6 years earlier, a real ceremony he had photographs of, attended by both families, a modest but genuine celebration in her home barangay that he described with a kind of wistful precision, as though narrating a happiness that had genuinely existed once, whatever had happened to it since, mentioning, almost as an aside, that Odessa's own mother had cried at that wedding too, the same mother who'd apparently never once mentioned any of this to me, across 18 months of pleasant, easy dinners. The marriage had been genuinely difficult almost from the start. Financial strain, Rodel working long hours as a mechanic to support their growing family, Odessa increasingly absent, increasingly evasive about her own time and whereabouts, a pattern he'd initially attributed to the ordinary strain of 2 young parents, stretched thin rather than anything more deliberate. He'd discovered, roughly 2 years earlier, that Odessa had been maintaining an online relationship with another foreign man, an Australian, that had ended, as far as he could tell, when that man's own family intervened before any money changed hands. A detail Rodel delivered with a specific, weary matter-of-factness that told me this wasn't the first time he'd had to explain his own marriage's shape to a bewildered stranger. He'd confronted her at the time. She'd promised it wouldn't happen again. He believed her, he told me, with a particular weariness in his voice, because believing her had always been considerably easier than the alternative. I asked him, because the question felt unavoidable, even as I understood how painful it likely was for him to answer, why he hadn't simply left after discovering that first relationship. He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table, his eyes fixed somewhere past my shoulder, as though the answer required him to look at something other than my own face while he gave it, and said, "Mr. Nightingale, we have 2 children. My daughter still asks for her mother even on the days her mother has not been kind to any of us. It is not so simple as leaving when you love people who did not choose any of this themselves." I didn't have a response for that. I don't think there was one to give, and I remember the specific, humbling silence that settled over that cafe table for a long moment afterward. Two men who'd arrived at that same small table for entirely different reasons and were now, somehow, sharing exactly the same kind of grief. Odessa arrived to collect me at 7:30, exactly as planned, walking toward the arrivals hall with the same easy, warm smile I'd flown 15 hours to see. Her hair done specially, I noticed, even in that first fractured second. Clearly dressed for the small welcome-back moment she'd imagined, rather than the one actually waiting for her. And I watched, through the cafe's glass wall, the precise moment she registered who was sitting across from me. I want to describe that moment as honestly as I can, because I've thought about it more than almost anything else since. Her face performed, in the space of perhaps 4 seconds, an entire collapsing narrative, recognition, then a flicker of something that might have been genuine panic, then a rapid, visible attempt to compose an expression that could plausibly carry her through whatever explanation she was already constructing. All of it happening with a speed that told me, more clearly than any single piece of documentation Rodell had shown me, exactly how practiced this particular emergency reflex had become for her. A woman recalibrating an entire performance in real time, live, through a pane of airport cafe glass. She came into the cafe anyway, because there was nowhere else for her to go, and I want to be honest that what followed wasn't the explosive confrontation I might once have imagined myself capable of staging. It was quieter than that, and somehow worse for its quietness. She sat down at the small table, looked at Rodell, looked at me, and said, her voice remarkably level given the circumstances, "Percy, I can explain everything, if you just let me explain." I asked her, my own voice steadier than I expected, whether any part of what she was about to say would actually change the fact that she had a husband and 2 children she'd never once mentioned across 18 months and £58,000. She didn't have an answer for that. She looked, instead, at Rodell and said something in a dialect I didn't understand, sharp and urgent, and he answered her, calmly, in English, apparently for my benefit as much as hers. I already told him, Odessa, everything, the tablet, the photographs, all of it. This is finished now. I pressed her once more, unable to leave it entirely alone despite understanding, even as I asked, that no answer she gave would meaningfully change anything at this point in the morning, the cafe around us carrying on with its own oblivious, ordinary business, a barista steaming milk somewhere behind the counter, as though nothing in the world had just come apart at our small table. I asked whether she'd ever, even once across those 18 months, genuinely considered telling me the truth herself, before an airport arrivals hall forced her hand. She was quiet for a long moment, glancing at Rodell and then back at me, and finally said, very softly, "I wanted it to be true, Percy. The life with you. I wanted it so much that I stopped thinking about how it could actually happen." I've turned that particular sentence over more times than almost any other from that whole morning, because there was something in it that felt, however inconvenient the timing, genuinely honest, the first thing she'd said to me that didn't sound rehearsed. The wedding didn't happen, obviously, 4 days later, or ever. I want to describe the immediate aftermath honestly, because I think the specifics matter. I checked into a hotel that same morning, a decent property not far from the airport that I'd have professionally rated quite highly under ordinary circumstances. The old professional habit of noting a property's standards kicking in, even through the numbness, cataloging, almost against my own will, the quality of the reception desk's greeting, the state of the corridor carpets, small, meaningless observations my mind reached for, simply because it needed somewhere ordinary to land, and spent the following 2 days in a kind of numb, methodical shock, canceling vendors, contacting the venue to explain there would be no wedding, working through the specific, humiliating logistics of unwinding 18 months of planning in the space of a single devastating morning, phone call after phone call delivered in the same flat, careful tone I'd once used to deliver bad news to a disappointed guest. I want to be honest that Rodell helped with some of this, more than I had any right to expect from a man who owed me nothing at all, translating a few difficult phone calls, sitting with me at my hotel one evening while I worked through the venue's cancellation policy, Two men who'd met that morning as strangers, sitting together that evening as something closer to allies. An unlikely companionship forged entirely out of shared, undeserved ruin. I contacted a lawyer once I'd returned to Plymouth. A careful woman named Beatriz Ledesma, recommended by an expat forum I'd found myself reading late into several sleepless nights, to understand what, if any, recourse I might have regarding the house. The deposit money that had already left the venue's account, the rings I'd never delivered. Sitting through a long, difficult first call with her, in which I laid out every document I still had, while she took careful notes on her end, occasionally asking me to repeat a specific date or figure so she could get the sequence exactly right before venturing any assessment at all. The assessment, once it arrived, was about what I'd feared. The house, purchased entirely in Odessa's name, given the legal restrictions on foreign ownership, offered me no clean path to recovery. My own lawyer's earlier review, having confirmed the structure was legally sound, precisely because it protected Odessa's ownership, rather than mine. A piece of due diligence that had, in the end, only ever protected the wrong party. The venue deposit was, by the venue's own terms, non-refundable regardless of the circumstances behind the cancellation. The rings, still in my own possession at least, represented the only piece of the whole £58,000 I could meaningfully claw back, selling them quietly through a jeweler back in Plymouth for considerably less than I'd paid. I called Claire, my daughter, about a week after returning home, and told her the whole thing, start to finish. The airport, Rodel, the children, Odessa's face through that café glass, sitting in my own quiet flat with the phone against my ear. The same flat I'd have been packing up for a permanent move abroad had any of this gone the way I'd spent 18 months planning. Boxes I'd already half filled still sitting untouched in the spare room, waiting for a decision I no longer needed to make. She was quiet for a long moment on the phone, and then she said, with more gentleness than I think I deserved given how little I'd shared with her across the preceding 18 months, Dad, I want to be honest. Some part of me wondered whether things were moving fast when you first told me about the wedding date, but I never once imagined anything like this. I'm just glad you found out before, not after. I told her I was too, though it had taken me several more days to actually feel the truth of that statement, rather than simply understanding it intellectually. I want to explain something about why I never once applied to Odessa the same careful scrutiny I'd applied, across an entire career, to nearly every other significant decision I ever made. 39 years managing hotels teaches you a particular kind of vigilance, reading a guest's mood before they've spoken, sensing a supplier's overly generous quote for the risk it actually represents, never once approving a significant transaction without independently verifying the claims underneath it, a discipline so thoroughly ingrained by decades of daily practice that I never once had to consciously remind myself to apply it. I applied every bit of that professional discipline to the house purchase, to the venue contract, to the rings, verifying paperwork, checking credentials, behaving, in every financial sense, like the careful, methodical man I'd always understood myself to be. What I never once thought to apply that same scrutiny to was the single foundational claim the entire relationship rested on, whether the woman I was marrying was actually free to marry me at all, because some part of me had simply never imagined that particular category of fact required independent verification from a partner who'd never once given me any reason, in 18 months of daily contact, to doubt her word about anything else. Rodel and I still message occasionally, an arrangement I want to describe honestly, because I think it's the single strangest and most genuinely valuable relationship to emerge from this entire experience. A correspondence neither of us could ever have predicted the morning we first shook hands at that airport cafe table. We exchange brief updates every few weeks, nothing elaborate, how his children are doing in school, how my own recovery back in Plymouth is progressing, the occasional dry, shared observation about the specific absurdity of our shared situation that only the two of us could ever fully appreciate, a private, gentle humor that has become, oddly, one of the more comforting fixtures of my new, quieter life. I asked him once, in one of these messages, whether he and Odessa were still together, and he told me, plainly, that they were, for the children's sake primarily, though the marriage itself existed now, he said, in a kind of permanent, managed distance, rather than anything resembling the partnership it had once at least partially been. I didn't press him further on that. It felt, and still feels, like territory that belongs entirely to him, rather than to me. I don't hate Odessa, though I want to be honest that this particular equanimity took considerably longer to arrive at than it did with some of the other, smaller griefs I've carried across a long life, months of turning the whole thing over on quiet evenings, before I could arrive at anything resembling this settled a view. I think, turning the whole experience over across many quiet evenings back here in Plymouth, that Odessa found herself, at some point in her own difficult marriage, in possession of a genuinely effective method for extracting both money and a kind of emotional escape from lonely foreign men who had no easy way of independently verifying her most basic claims about her own life. And that she'd likely run some version of this exact structure before me, with the Australian man Rodell mentioned, and quite possibly since, wherever she's currently directing whatever version of her attention I once received so completely. I don't think that understanding excuses what happened to me. £58,000 in 18 months I can't get back regardless of the psychology underneath it, but I've stopped needing her to have been simply, cartoonishly evil, in order for my own losses to make sense, the same way I've stopped needing myself to have been simply gullible, a label I'd have applied to myself without hesitation in the first raw weeks, but that I no longer think is either accurate or useful. There was one message from Rodell, arriving roughly 6 months after that airport morning, on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday evening, while I was sitting with my own dinner in front of the television, that I've kept, unlike most of our exchanges, saved, rather than simply read and set aside. He'd written, without much preamble, that his daughter had asked him, out of nowhere one evening while he was helping her with homework, whether her mother had ever loved anyone else properly, a question he hadn't quite known how to answer honestly for a 7-year-old, a question that had apparently arrived sideways, the way children's hardest questions often do, tucked in between an arithmetic problem and a request for a snack. He asked me, almost tentatively, whether I thought Odessa had loved either of us properly, whether that word even applied to whatever she'd actually been doing across those parallel years. I thought about that question for several days before answering, longer than I've taken to answer almost anything else in my life, drafting and redrafting the reply more times than I'd care to admit, and told him, finally, that I thought she'd loved the feeling of being loved completely, by more than one person at once, more than she'd ever loved any single one of us in the ordinary sense, and that I didn't think either of us would ever get a cleaner answer than that. He wrote back a single line. That is what I think also. Thank you for saying it plainly. I don't know why that particular exchange has stayed with me more than almost any other detail of this whole affair, but it has. A small, honest moment of genuine connection, built entirely out of two men's shared wreckage. I think, more than almost anything else from this whole experience, about that specific moment watching Odessa's face through the café glass, the 4 seconds it took a genuinely skilled performer to recognize that her performance had finally, completely run out of road. I spent 39 years reading exactly that kind of moment in other people. A guest's face when a promised upgrade fell through. A supplier's face when a contract dispute finally surfaced. The specific, involuntary flicker that appears just before someone composes themselves into whatever version of calm they're about to attempt. And I understood, watching her that morning with a strange, detached clarity, that I was witnessing the single most honest expression she'd ever shown me across our entire relationship, precisely because it was the one expression she'd never once had time to prepare in advance. My reckoning from all this is, I think, oddly shaped compared to most stories like it. I lost £58,000 and a future I'd genuinely, carefully planned for, and that loss is real, and I don't want to minimize it in the telling. The particular grief of a man in his mid-60s, watching a second, unexpected chance at real companionship dissolve in the space of a single morning. But the man who actually delivered me the truth that morning was a man Odessa had wronged considerably longer and considerably more deeply than she'd ever wronged me. A husband and father who'd spent years absorbing exactly the kind of quiet, ongoing betrayal I experienced in a single devastating morning, and who chose, even in the middle of his own genuine devastation, to spend 3 careful weeks planning exactly how to deliver a stranger's truth as gently and as fairly as the situation could possibly allow. Some victims, I've come to understand, deliver each other, not out of any obligation, but simply because one of them happened to be standing closer to the exit when the whole structure finally, completely came down, and decided, in that moment, that the decent thing to do was reach back for the other man still standing inside it. I still live in Plymouth, still look out at the Hoe most mornings with my coffee, a quieter, more cautious life than the one I'd been so carefully planning 18 months ago, the flat itself unchanged, though I notice, some mornings, how differently the light falls across it now, compared to how I once imagined it would feel emptied out entirely, packed up and shipped abroad to a life that was never actually going to happen. I've started, slowly, telling a version of this story to a few of the other retired men I've come to know through that same expat forum, where I first found Beatrice, gathering occasionally for a pint at a pub not far from my flat, comparing our own separate, similarly shaped cautionary tales with the specific, dry humor men our age tend to reach for, once enough time has passed to make the telling bearable. I do this not to discourage them from finding genuine connection abroad, which I still believe is entirely possible, but to offer them the one specific, hard-won piece of wisdom I wish someone had given me before I ever booked that first flight. Verify the one fact that everything else depends on before you verify anything else at all. I checked the paperwork on a house. I never once checked whether the woman I was building a life with was actually free to build it with me, and I've come to understand that no amount of careful, professional scrutiny applied to everything else can substitute for that single, foundational question, asked plainly, answered honestly, before a single pound ever changes hands.